The 2024 NFL season has seen many teams start off very hot, but unfortunately kind of fall off towards the second half of the season. So in today's video, I want to talk about the top 5 NFL teams that in my opinion are starting to kind of fall apart. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. Let's just hop right into it. And we are going to begin with at number 5, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now I kind of feel bad about including the Buccaneers in this list because to be honest with you, the reason why they're on this list is mainly just because of injuries. I will say there are other reasons why this team is starting to fall apart a tad bit. It's not just injuries. The defense has underperformed a tad bit. Defensively speaking, they rank 24th in opponents' points per game, 29th in opponents' yards per game, and 24th in opponents' touchdowns per game, which is extremely disappointing because when you look on the offensive side of things, they rank extremely high in many statistics. They rank 4th in points per game, 7th in yards per game, and 4th in touchdowns per game. Again, a pretty big contrast from being in the top 5, top 10 offensively, and then being around that 20 to 30 range on the defensive side of things. Unfortunately for the Buccaneers, they started the season off with a 3-1 record. They had wins over the likes of the Philadelphia Eagles, a win over the Detroit Lions, and a win against the Washington Commanders. All 3 of those teams, by the way, are very good teams. But then since that Eagles game, they had a bad loss to the Falcons where they lost in overtime. Then they beat up on the Saints. That was a bad Saints team. We kind of all expected it. But then they lost to the Baltimore Ravens by 10, the Falcons by 5, the Chiefs by 6, the Niners by 3, and then most recently they finally got back in the winning column by beating up on Tommy DeVito and the New York Giants. Currently they sit with a 5-6 record, which is a massive fall from glory when they were just 3-1 a few weeks ago. It's unfortunate because as I mentioned earlier, I think a big reason why this team is struggling as much as they are is just because of kind of injuries. Again, the defense has its faults and it's definitely not a great defense. They definitely need to look to address certain positions in the offseason, but having injuries to guys like Mike Evans for several weeks, Chris Godwin for probably the rest of the year has definitely hurt this offense. I mean, still, even despite the injuries, they're still consistently dropping almost 30 to 25 points a game. But because this team is fundamentally built upon their offense with those guys playing at a high level, they just can't really keep up with these really good offenses. It's a shame because I feel like if those guys were healthy, this team would at least have a above 500 record, because I personally believe with those guys, they would have beaten the likes of the 49ers. They maybe even could have beaten the Chiefs, and I think they likely could have even beaten the Falcons. Again, that's a lot of hypothetical speak here, but it's just a little bit of a bummer. I kind of feel like I feel bad for putting them on this list because I like this team and I think they should be better than what they actually are. But hey, wins and losses count, and unfortunately they are below 500 despite the injuries and despite the bad play on defense. But let's go ahead and move on to number 4, the Atlanta Falcons. Now, the Falcons have a number of different reasons why they're starting to fall off. The biggest one being that they just have no pass rush on the defensive side of the football. Defensively, statistically speaking, they rank 25th in opponents' points per game, 25th in opponents' yards per game, and 17th in opponents' touchdowns per game. The Atlanta Falcons also rank, I believe, near the bottom of pressure percentage as well as sacks per game. Again, kind of similar to the Buccaneers, the offense for the Atlanta Falcons hasn't been bad this year. They rank 16th in points per game, 8th in yards per game, and 13th in touchdowns per game. The offense has been inconsistent, but when it has been on, they've typically been able to win the games. But when the offense hasn't been good, the defense just cannot get enough pressure and cannot create turnovers enough and create enough stops to keep the games competitive. At one point, the Atlanta Falcons were 4-2 and looking like one of the better teams in the NFL. Hell, I even put them in my personal top 10 power rankings. Unfortunately, since then, ever since going 4-2, they've had a couple of really bad losses. They lost, obviously, to the Seahawks by 20. They lost to the New Orleans Saints by 3, and then most recently they lost by 32 to the Denver Broncos. Currently, the Atlanta Falcons only have a 6-5 record, which is very disappointing from, like I mentioned, 4-2 just a couple weeks ago. I do think the Atlanta Falcons are a good team with really good players, but having a quarterback that isn't very mobile, who's kind of a statue in the pocket, having a defensive line that just simply cannot generate pressure, and having a head coach that's a little bit stubborn on the defensive side of the football and not adjusting by sending blitzes and, doing different things to help the defense out is really causing this Falcons team season to kind of fall down the tank. They had a really sizable lead in the division by having a really good record, whereas the Saints have fallen apart, the Bucs started to fall apart, and the Carolina Panthers are the Carolina Panthers. But now they're 6-5, and a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are now only one game behind and potentially could find a way to still win the division, which is very disappointing because, as I mentioned earlier, the Falcons had a massive lead in the division. They were playing some of their best football, and then since then, they just have had a couple just really bad losses. This Broncos game, if you ask me, kind of captures everything that is wrong with this Falcons team. I mean, Bo Nix was basically playing 7-on-7 because the pass rush was just abysmal the entire day. The Broncos defense is really good and can force a guy like Kirk Cousins to make some really tough tight window throws, and if Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan aren't really going in that game, it's really tough to get the offense going because Kirk Cousins is a good quarterback, but he's not a playmaker, so it's kind of a tough situation for Atlanta. I still think they're a good team, and I still think they could win the division, but yeah, it's unfortunate. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt, I'll be really quick, but I have started a brand new YouTube channel called Metro Stories. On this channel, we simply focus on actual stories of NFL teams and NFL players, so if that sort of stuff interests you, make sure to go ahead and check it out. It'll be in the description below as well as in the pinned comment. Go ahead and check it out. I think you might like it. Let's get back to the video though. But let's go ahead and move on to number 3, the Chicago Bears. At one point, similar to the Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears had a 4-2 record and were looking like, one of the better teams in the NFC. Maybe not a true contender, but a genuine playoff contender. They had wins over the Titans, the Rams, the Panthers, and the Jaguars. And yes, those are not good teams, especially the Rams weren't the Rams who we are today. But in some of those games, they were dominating them. There was a 36-10 win over Carolina, a 35-16 win over Jacksonville. And then you had the bye week, and then since then, they haven't won a game. They lost by 3 to the Washington Commanders. Yes, it was a Hail Mary. It's unfortunate, but hey, you still lost. Then you had a 20-point loss to the Arizona Cardinals, a 16-point loss to the New England Patriots, who, by the way, are one of the worst teams in the NFL. Then you had a 1-point loss to Green Bay and an overtime loss to the Minnesota Vikings. They currently have a 4-7 record, and it's been primarily because of just some inconsistencies on the offense. Typically in these type of videos, you're going to talk about the defense underperforming, but the Bears defense has kind of done their job. Statistically speaking, defensively, they're only giving up 19.7 points per game, which ranks them number 8 in the NFL. They're only allowing 339 yards a game, which is 17th best in the NFL, and they're only giving up 1.9 touchdowns per game, which is the 5th best in the NFL. And for the most part, most of their statistics defensively are within the top 10. They do rank 25th in opponents' yards per play, and their rushing defense isn't great, but for the most part, they're a really solid unit in totality. Unfortunately, though, it's the offense that really starts to kind of showcase the flaws of this team, because they rank 22nd in points per game, 26th in yards per game, and 18th in touchdowns per game. This team does not have a consistent running game to rely upon. I like DeAndre Swift, but he's kind of a boomer bust type player. And Caleb Williams, even though I think he's having a fine rookie season, has shown inconsistencies. He's going to have one game where he's going to have an incredible showcase. He's not going to turn the ball over, and he's going to play some clean football. And then on other days, he's going to play not so clean football, have some turnover-worthy plays, and just not play a good brand of football. It was kind of to be expected for a young quarterback like Caleb who's trying to figure out the NFL, but, it is a little bit disappointing that it's happened for this year because this Bears team is talented enough to genuinely make a playoff run. Again, I think everyone's expectations for Caleb was to come in and instantly be Patrick Mahomes, which I thought was always kind of ridiculous. I feel like this is a good start to his career, but it definitely could be better. This Bears team started off so well, but they've kind of fallen apart. Again, some of the losses on there are just kind of tough losses, like a 1-point loss to Green Bay where you had a chance to win it, a loss to the Washington Commanders because of a Hail Mary. It's unfortunate. I feel like this team is better than what the record says, but hey, 4-7 is 4-7. However, at number 2, we're going to be talking about the Houston Texans. This one is kind of a tough one to talk about because I like a lot of the players on this Texans team. Guys like CJ Stroud, Joe Mixon, Nico Collins are some of my favorite players in the entire NFL. But unfortunately, really since week 6, this team has just not been a very good team. They started the season off really well. They were 5-1 at one point. They had wins over teams like Buffalo, Chicago. Yes, they had an ugly loss to Minnesota, but still the team was looking like one of the better teams out there. But since losing to New England when they had a 5-1 record, they've only won 2 games since, and they've lost 4 games. So they're 2-4 over their last 6 weeks. They have losses to some not so good teams like the Jets and the Tennessee Titans. And yes, you lost to Detroit by 3 and lost to Green Bay by 2, but you're supposed to be one of the better teams out there. You should be able to find a way to win those games. And since that New England game, their best win is against the Colts, and they also beat the Dallas Cowboys, who were 2 of the not-so-good teams in the NFL. I think maybe the biggest regression for this team from what we saw last year has been within the offensive line. The offensive line last year was actually pretty good, and even though I like the names on the defense isn't. And even though I like some of the names on the offensive line just isn't performing as well as we thought they would perform. Statistically speaking, the offense isn't that impressive, especially for what our expectations were for this Texans team. They ranked 12th in points per game, 16th in yards per game, and 15th in touchdowns per game. And defensively speaking, it's also not great. It's not bad. Again, this team is not a bad team, but it's not as good as you would maybe like it to be. Defensively, they rank 15th in opponents' points per game, 5th in opponents' yards per game, and 19th in opponents' touchdowns per game. I would say maybe one of the more concerning things about this team, again, going back to the offensive line, they rank 26th in quarterback sack percentage with a high rate of 8.87%. I think we also do potentially have to have a bit of a conversation about CJ Stroud having some regression within his personal game. I feel like it's kind of understandable for a quarterback like Stroud to really struggle in a sophomore season because defenses are figuring out ways to make him uncomfortable. It's the same thing that happened to guys like Dak Prescott and many other great quarterbacks. I do think CJ will be better because of it, and I think in years 3, 4, and 5, he's going to be an awesome quarterback. I have no worries about his long-term future, but there has been some, small regressions within his game. I still think he's a good quarterback, but is he a top 10 quarterback? Maybe on the 10th side of things. This was a guy who was hyped up to potentially be the MVP. I always kind of thought those were unfair expectations, but he did have those expectations coming into the season. Regardless, this Texans team still has a good chance to make the playoffs and still has a good chance to win the division. It is just disappointing to go from 5-1 to 7-5. However, at my number 1 spot is going to be the Washington Commanders. Now, if you guys want to prefer to put the Texans number 1, it doesn't really matter to me. This is just a general list, but the Washington Commanders will be my personal number 1. At one point, the Washington Commanders had a record of 7-2 and were looking like one of the best, bright, young teams in the NFL. However, since that 7-2 record, they have lost 3 straight games, 3 games against some, quality opponents. They lost to the Steelers by 1, they lost to the Eagles by 8, and they most recently lost to the Dallas Cowboys by 8 as well. This was a team that I don't feel like anyone had expectations of being all that good this year. I feel like most of us thought they would be better with Jaden Daniels and the new head coach and some new pieces, but I feel like the expectations for this team was like a potentially 8-9 type of record. But after they came out with a hot start, and after that, really the Bengals game, I feel like the expectations for this team just changed dramatically. But after that, they really went on a really nice stretch of winning a lot of good games, and their loss was really only to good teams like the Baltimore Ravens and the Buccaneers in week 1. I feel like if you had told me at the beginning of the year that through 12 weeks the Commanders would be 7-5, I'd be thrilled about that. But if you had told me they went 7-2 and then lost 3 straight, that would be a little bit disappointing. Similar to most of the quarterbacks within this draft class, Jaden Daniels has been good, but has also shown some inconsistencies, especially as of late. I don't necessarily want to put a lot of the blame on Jaden Daniels because I think the play calling needs a little bit of the blame there as well. The running game hasn't been terribly effective the past couple weeks, and it's a rookie quarterback, so I just have a hard time putting all of the blame on Jaden Daniels, especially when he accounts for so much of this offense. The offense has felt a little bit stagnant as of late, and it's felt a little bit predictable, and it's kind of the curse of Cliff Kingsbury, where it's like he comes out to such incredible starts, and then as the season goes along, he just, for some reason, just loses his control a tad bit. The defense has also kind of regressed the past couple of weeks. It hasn't been a great defense all year, but it's been doing its job. But lately it hasn't been, especially against the Dallas Cowboys, which is just not a good offense. Unfortunately, I don't feel like the statistics tell us that much about this team, because even though they rank very highly on the offensive end, it does feel like lately it hasn't been living up to that level that it used to be. However, I do think the defense is kind of playing up to their statistics. Right now, they rank 18th in allowed points per game, 16th in allowed yards per game, and 25th in opponents' touchdowns per game. I kind of feel like that is the level of play that I've expected from this defense kind of all year long. It's a better unit than what it was last year. Still not a good unit, though. For Washington, again, this was a season that was always about progression and seeing how good this team could be in Jaden Daniels' first year. And for a 7-5 record, I definitely don't think you're terribly disappointed. It is just a little bit disappointing that you weren't 7-2 to start the season off, and things are starting to unravel a tad bit, and this team just doesn't feel as good as it once was. The good news for them is that their next 2 opponents are Tennessee and New Orleans, and they also have the Cowboys in week 18, so I think they could easily get to double-digit wins just because of their record, but in terms of the playoffs, we'll see how they do. But if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.